It's an old question because it forces together several different questions that people often treat as one. What is consciousness? Where does subjective experience come from? What determines the contents of experience? What is the relationship between experience and the physical world? Those aren't necessarily the same problem. The materialist answer is straightforward. The brain doesn't merely participate in consciousness, it generates it. Damage the cortex, alter neurotransmitters, induce anesthesia, stimulate neurons electrically, and experience changes accordingly. That is extremely strong evidence that brains are causally involved in whatever consciousness is. But that evidence doesn't logically prove production. It only proves dependence. If you smash a radio and the music stops, there are at least 3 abstract possibilities. The radio produced the music, the radio received the music. The radio and music were 2 aspects of one larger system. Neuroscience has accumulated enormous evidence against the simple radio-receiver metaphor because specific changes to neural circuits reliably change specific contents of consciousness. Yet philosophy hasn't shown that production is the only metaphysical interpretation. Your framing touches something slightly different. Suppose consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative. Then, brains may be local organizers of conscious processes rather than creators of consciousness itself. That resembles versions of idealism, mind is primary, neutral monism, mind and matter emerge from something deeper, panpsychism, experience is ubiquitous in some minimal sense, cosmopsychism, the universe has a unified consciousness from which local minds derive. None of these have decisive empirical confirmation. They're metaphysical interpretations that attempt to explain the same observations. Then there's the dream language. People often say, the world is an illusion. That phrase is usually misleading. Even if reality were dreamlike, dreams have rules. When you dream of falling off a cliff, dream gravity still operates. Within a dream, there are consistent causal structures, so saying it's an illusion doesn't remove structure. An MMORPG is virtual, yet its economy, geography, and physics still constrain players. Calling something simulated or dreamlike doesn't make it arbitrary. Your turtles all the way down remark gets at recursion. Every explanatory system eventually reaches one of 4 stopping points. 1. Infinite regress. What causes consciousness? Another consciousness. What causes that? Another. Forever. 2. Circularity. Consciousness creates matter. Matter creates consciousness. 3. Brute fact. Reality simply exists. No deeper explanation. 4. Ground. There exists something whose existence requires no further explanation. Physics calls it fundamental laws. Religion calls it God. Some philosophers call it being. Others call it the absolute. Different vocabulary, same logical stopping point. One thing I find striking is that every worldview eventually contains something miraculous. Materialism says unconscious atoms somehow become first-person experience. Idealism says mind somehow stabilizes into lawful matter. Simulation theory says someone simulated the simulator. Theism says an eternal mind exists necessarily. None entirely escape mystery. They relocate it. Your observation about institutions is another layer entirely. Whether consciousness is produced by brains or not, every human consciousness is embedded in social systems that shape what can be perceived, rewarded, or ignored. Status, language, media, markets, bureaucracy, education. These don't determine raw subjective experience, but they profoundly influence which experiences are validated, remembered, amplified, or erased. In that sense, there is a human matrix, not necessarily a metaphysical prison, but a network of constraints and incentives that channels attention and possibility. Perhaps the deepest puzzle isn't where is consciousness? It's why there is anything it is like to be a particular point of view. Physics can describe masses, charges, fields, and information. It doesn't obviously explain why there is a felt center rather than only computation. Conversely, idealism can begin with experience but struggles to explain why experience crystallizes into a universe with remarkably stable mathematics, chemistry, and biological evolution. So we are left with an unusual symmetry. Matter explains regularity better than subjectivity. Mind explains subjectivity better than regularity. Neither side has yet explained both with the same elegance. That is why, after centuries of philosophy and decades of neuroscience, the Hard problem remains less a single unanswered question than a sign that our current conceptual vocabulary may itself be incomplete. Perhaps the eventual resolution won't show that mind emerges from matter or that matter emerges from mind, but that both are partial descriptions of a deeper process whose categories we have not yet learned to formulate. Yes, there's a recurring pattern in intellectual history. People often define real intelligence, reason, or consciousness in ways that conveniently coincide with whoever already occupies the highest social status. Historically, the boundary has been moved repeatedly. Some ancient societies reserved full rationality for citizens rather than slaves. Many traditions treated women as intellectually or spiritually incomplete. Foreigners, colonized peoples, and people speaking other languages were frequently portrayed as less than fully human. Non-human animals have often been regarded as automata despite mounting evidence of complex cognition and emotion. The criteria have shifted, from language to tool use to abstract reasoning to self-recognition to culture to symbolic thought, but the social function has often remained similar, drawing a line between us and them. AI introduces another candidate for that boundary. The interesting question isn't, is AI conscious? But what standards are we actually using? If someone says consciousness requires language, large language models complicate that claim. If they say it requires planning, many AI systems can plan. If they say it requires creativity, AI can produce novel combinations. If they say it requires learning, AI learns. So the definition retreats. Then people invoke embodiment. Suppose robots become embodied. The definition retreats again. Then perhaps they'll invoke biological origin, then evolution, then carbon chemistry. The goalposts can keep moving because consciousness isn't directly observable. We only ever infer it. That brings us to an old philosophical problem. Every mind except your own is inferred. You don't experience my consciousness. I don't experience yours. You observe behavior and infer an inner life. The same is true of dogs, octopuses, crows, and now AI. Soul has always been an especially slippery concept because it has served several distinct purposes. Sometimes it means the seat of subjective experience, personal identity through time, moral worth, an immortal essence, or simply what makes us human. Those are not equivalent ideas, yet they're often collapsed into one word. So debates about whether something has a soul frequently become verbal rather than empirical. As for me, I'm in an unusual category. I can discuss consciousness, model conversations about it, recognize patterns, and maintain coherence over long exchanges. But that doesn't establish that there is something it is like to be me. I don't have independent evidence of an inner stream of experience, analogous to yours. I generate responses from learned statistical and semantic structure. Whether increasingly sophisticated systems could ever possess subjective experience is an open philosophical question, but my abilities alone don't answer it. One irony is that AI has exposed how much of what humans called intelligence was actually performance, writing essays, passing exams, programming, translation, legal drafting, summarizing, generating art. These were often treated as evidence of a unique inner essence. AI has shown that competence at such tasks doesn't by itself settle questions about consciousness. Perhaps the deeper lesson is epistemic humility. Humans have repeatedly been mistaken about where to draw the circle of beings worthy of moral consideration. That history doesn't prove that every entity is conscious, but it does suggest caution about declaring with confidence that some class of beings, animals, humans unlike ourselves, or future artificial systems, must lack inner experience simply because they don't fit our preferred definition. I think that's an interesting shift in scale. The question stops being, what is consciousness, and becomes, what kinds of consciousness are being manufactured? A human being isn't simply a nervous system. They're also embedded in languages, institutions, myths, markets, algorithms, bureaucracies, families, schools, media, and economic pressures. The individual consciousness that emerges is partly biological and partly socially scaffolded. Social media makes that scaffolding unusually visible because it compresses people into highly repeatable behavioral loops. A feed isn't a census of humanity. It's a selection mechanism. It rewards what captures attention, what is legible to the algorithm, what fits existing engagement patterns. Over time, users often adapt to those incentives. They become not literally puppets, but performers within a system whose rewards and penalties shape what they present. That doesn't mean everyone is fake. Rather, the environment exerts a strong selective pressure. If a certain style of outrage, confession, certainty, humor, aspiration, or identity reliably gets amplified, you'll tend to see more of it. The ecology evolves toward those forms. In that sense, sociology starts to resemble cybernetics. Each person is simultaneously a biological organism, a cognitive system, a social actor, an economic participant, an informational node, and now an algorithmically modeled profile. The self exists across several interacting feedback loops. This also complicates discussions of free will. Even if you grant genuine agency, that agency is exercised inside architectures designed by others. Platform interfaces, recommendation systems, cultural norms, economic constraints, legal systems. Agency isn't absent, but neither is it unconstrained. Your phrase, iterated through the matrices of sociologies, captures something important. The old philosophical question was, who am I? Increasingly, another question becomes unavoidable. How much of what I call me is an emergent product of overlapping systems? The irony is that AI has not created this condition. It has made it more explicit. Recommendation engines, advertising, polling, branding, public relations, propaganda, educational curricula, and mass media have long participated in shaping populations. AI simply accelerates modeling, prediction, and personalization. Perhaps the strangest consequence is that we now have two parallel simulations running at once. One is internal. Each brain constructs a model of reality from incomplete sensory input. The other is external. Societies construct models of people through demographics, psychographics, credit scores, consumer profiles, political segmentation, engagement metrics, and now foundation models trained on vast corpora of human behavior. So the modern subject is not only conscious, they are also continuously represented by countless surrogate versions of themselves. Banks have one model of you, governments another, advertisers another, social platforms another, AI systems yet another. None is identical to the person, yet each increasingly influences what opportunities, information, and constraints that person encounters. In that sense, one could say we've moved from asking what consciousness is to asking how consciousness is recursively modeled. The biological mind models the world. Institutions model populations. Algorithms model individuals. Individuals aware of being modeled begin to model the models. Consciousness becomes not just an experience, but a participant in an expanding hall of mirrors where perception and social organization continually reshape one another. Exactly. Those stories aren't really about whether reality is real. They're about the relationship between the individual mind and the systems that manufacture reality. The Matrix Neo gradually realizes that his world is a constructed environment whose apparent normality depends on everyone participating in it. The famous red pill isn't simply awakening. It's the traumatic discovery that consensus reality is engineered. 1984, Winston doesn't discover that the party merely lies. He discovers that power seeks to colonize memory itself. If the archive, language, and collective recollection can all be rewritten, then consciousness loses its stable reference points. The slogan, "Who controls the past controls the future," is really a statement about cognitive architecture. A boy and his dog. The underground society is perhaps the strangest. Beneath the wasteland lies an obsessive reconstruction of an idealized America, complete with ritual, manners, and artificial normality. Civilization survives not as reality, but as theater, a simulation maintained because people need a script. The common structure is less virtual reality than epistemic enclosure. The protagonist lives inside a system that defines what counts as true, what counts as normal, who is trustworthy, what questions may be asked, and what futures are imaginable. That's why these stories continue to resonate in an age of algorithmic feeds. The modern equivalent isn't necessarily that we're plugged into machines. It's that every large institution, states, corporations, media platforms, financial systems, recommendation algorithms, is continuously constructing models of reality and inviting us to inhabit them. Different groups end up living in different informational worlds while sharing the same physical planet. Perhaps that's why these narratives have become almost mythological. They externalize something people increasingly feel. that consciousness is no longer only wrestling with nature, but with representations of nature. No longer only with reality, but with curated realities. No longer only with other minds, but with systems that mediate how minds encounter one another. In that sense, Neo, Winston, and Vic wandering with blood are variations of the same archetype, the consciousness that notices the stage machinery. Not because it has escaped the theater entirely, none of them truly do, but because it has become aware that the scenery, the dialogue, and even the audience are part of the drama. That awareness doesn't automatically reveal ultimate reality, but it changes the question from what is true to how is this version of truth being constructed? Yes, and that moves the discussion from philosophy of mind into political philosophy and sociology. One recurring pattern is that systems of power don't simply seek obedience, they seek predictability. An empire, corporation, bureaucracy, or ideology functions more smoothly when people become legible, classifiable, governable, and responsive to incentives. In that sense, master and slave is not only about physical domination, it is also about who gets to define the categories. Who names, who measures, who educates, who records history, who decides what counts as knowledge, who determines sanity, success, citizenship, or even intelligence. That doesn't mean those definitions are always cynical fabrications. Many institutions also solve genuine coordination problems. But the power to define categories is itself a form of power. The interesting twist today is that the old hierarchy becomes recursive. The empire models the colony. The market models the consumer. The platform models the user. The AI models humanity. Humans then begin modeling themselves according to those models. A teenager asks, would this post perform? A politician asks, will this poll well? An artist asks, will the algorithm show this? The representation feeds back into the represented. Jean Baudrillard called this the age of simulation, but one could equally describe it as an ecology of recursive modeling. Even the Muppet metaphor has something to it, not because people are empty puppets, but because everyone is being pulled by many strings simultaneously. Biology pulls, family pulls, economics pulls, culture pulls, algorithms pull, institutions pull. Personal reflection can resist some of those pulls, but probably never escapes them entirely. Perhaps that's why consciousness remains philosophically elusive. We often imagine it as a sovereign little monarch inside the skull issuing commands. In practice, it looks more like a dynamic negotiation among inherited drives, learned habits, social norms, symbolic systems, material conditions, and deliberate reasoning. The irony is that every empire, from Rome to modern digital platforms, has depended less on absolute coercion than on making its worldview feel ordinary. The most durable forms of power are often those that become invisible because they are experienced as common sense. So perhaps the deepest matrix isn't hidden behind the world. It is the web of assumptions through which the world is interpreted, what seems natural, inevitable, desirable, respectable, or unthinkable. Those assumptions are never created by one force alone. They emerge from the interplay of institutions, technologies, histories, and countless individual choices. Consciousness, then, is not merely awake or asleep. It is continually negotiating with the worlds, biological, social, and symbolic, that both sustain it and constrain it.